Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do another round of thriller and horror books. I have some rather popular titles here, so I think you'll be interested in my opinions on them. And as always, there are hits, there are misses, and hopefully you'll find something you enjoy. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about thrillers, and yes, I finally read The Silent Patient. This was a super buzzy thriller book when it came out, and I'm only getting to it now. This follows a woman who is accused of killing her husband because she was found over his dead body, and certainly looks like she was the killer. And she, after that event, no longer speaks, and so she goes to live in a mental institution. And the story is primarily told from the perspective of the psychologist who goes on to work with her in the facility where she resides. And then we also get snippets from her diary leading up to the death of her husband. This seems to be one of these books that you either love or hate, and for the most part, I don't see a lot of people with mediocre feelings about it, but I'm actually one of those. So I liked it, but I didn't love it. So hear me out. I was really intrigued by the premise of this one. I picked up this book when I was in a reading slump, meaning I was just picking up books and putting them down. I couldn't get into anything. And then I started this one and the beginning hooked me in. I really like the narrative voice of the psychologist because I found his perspective to be very interesting, and you learn very early on in very subtle ways that he's perhaps a little bit unstable, or at least more emotionally attached than he should be. And I really like that. He's a little bit chaotic. He has imperfections and problems in his personal life, and it all starts to seep into the story. And so I really liked reading the story through his eyes, and then from there just enjoyed seeing where the story went. I wasn't trying overly hard to predict where it was going, and so I'm not sure if the clues were really in place for me to predict the twist. I feel like other people saw this coming a mile away. I did not, so I actually enjoyed where the story went. I was warned that a lot of people thought I would hate the ending because I can be really picky when it comes to thriller twists. But you know what? I enjoyed it, again, probably because it was a surprise to me and it was just fun. However, this wasn't a 5-star read for me. This wasn't the best thriller I have ever read. And I think it's just the fact that I look for something more. I found the story to be very simple. And admittedly, I do really like a dark thriller. And certainly while there's death and all of that, I look for a thriller that has some more disturbing, almost horror aspects to it, which this didn't really have. So enjoyed it. I would recommend it if you're one of the last people who hasn't read it. Not going to be for everyone, but if you're looking for a fun thriller just to fly through, this one was definitely that for me. Next, I want to talk about The Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. And this is actually a young adult thriller, and I typically don't read a lot of them, but this is one I wanted to pick up for a few reasons. And it follows a young teenage girl in an Ojibwe tribe who is living in her community when there is a violent death, and she ends up getting pulled into an undercover investigation in order to protect her community members and find out what is going on. I'm going to try to keep the actual premise pretty vague, but this book is a thriller, so there definitely is a lot of action. You get the police involved in this undercover investigation, but for the most part, it read a lot more like a contemporary. So the reason I was interested in picking this up is that it's an own voices story told from an Indigenous perspective, which is something I am personally very interested in reading about. And I did like those aspects. You learn a lot about life on reserve, being a First Nation person both in Canada and in the States. And I certainly did learn a lot. However, I normally love stories where you get this information about the culture and traditions and life on reserve and so forth. But this book actually pushed it so far that it started to feel like info dumps. I have learned more about registering for being a community member than I ever wanted to know. The character just went on for paragraphs and paragraphs explaining the intricacies to the other characters, and it, like I said, info dump is a word I want to use because it was way too much and it just broke my immersion in the story. As for the mystery or thriller itself, it was honestly pretty predictable. I saw some of the twists and turns coming, although there was a surprise along the way. And unfortunately, I do have to acknowledge the fact that there was a love interest in this book, which I did not love because I just don't like my romance, especially young adult romance. But it was dealt with fairly well towards the end. I did like the resolution of it, which I'll keep, vague of course, but this book did some things I enjoyed, but overall it was really long and again, too much information that really took away from just having the experience of falling into a story and getting lost in it, which is really why I read. It was not overly dark, and again, it was very predictable. It reminded me of a young adult version of Winter Counts, one of my favorite thrillers from 2020. So if you're interested in the plot, but you don't like reading YA books, I would actually recommend Winter Counts, which I thought was a stronger story that still has that Indigenous aspect of a thriller story set on reserve, but just avoided a lot of the YA tropes that personally bug me a lot. Next, I want to briefly mention a horror book I read, and that was Cradle Lake by Ronald Malfi. This follows a couple that move to a small town. They are trying to get a fresh start. You find out that they have a difficult past, and the wife is dealing with depression from a recent miscarriage. And so they begin to live within the community, but soon enough they realize that these townspeople have their own secrets, somehow involving the nearby lake, and the story goes from there. I have said so many times how much I enjoy Ronald Malfi's storytelling, and I read this book right around the same time as that reading slump, and this one definitely held my attention as well. I just find his books very easy to get into, but this one was not my favorite of his work. I just didn't find the story itself as interesting as some of his other setups. I did like and also hate the relationship between the couple. It was perhaps very realistic for a marriage, but also very, very frustrating because the husband is not the perfect husband by any means, and the relationship dynamics between the couple were very frustrating at times. Definitely it deals with infertility and miscarriage, issues that I personally love to see in fiction, as well as complicated marriages, which is something I do love to see explored. But for whatever reason, it just kind of missed the mark for me, and I did find it honestly a little bit forgettable. So I wouldn't recommend starting here with Ronald Malfi, but if you're reading through all of his books, this one definitely is worth checking off the list. Last, I want to talk about The Wolves of Winter by Tyrell Johnson. This is a post-apocalyptic story that kind of crosses the lines between science fiction and horror, and is set up in the Yukon, where a family goes to escape the apocalyptic events that are happening around the world, and they go off to live there. The story is told from the perspective of the young daughter, who I believe is in her 20s, but she feels like a younger character. So I want to mention, and I checked this many times, this book, to the best of my knowledge, is classified as adult fiction, but it read like young adult fiction. So for some of you that might have some appeal. If you're someone who enjoys reading over the different age categories, this one is very easy to fall into, but the character read young to me, and it really did follow some of those YA tropes. Again, a little bit more of the romance and some of the predictableness that I find just tends to fall into the age category. So this one wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. I'm always looking for wintry horror books, and this one definitely had those aspects. They do have the aspects of survival, but I think that this book will shallow in comparison to some of the really iconic post-apocalyptic books that are out there. So in terms of the apocalyptic event itself, this book actually has multiple ones. So you have a virus outbreak, you have bombs that are being shot off between countries, and there are a lot of moving parts. And I feel like it's a story that the author was trying to put too many different story elements into one book. They wanted to tell all of the apocalyptic stories in one shot, and it would have worked better if the author had backed off a little bit and just focused on the intimate tale that he was trying to tell. So I like parts of this book. There was some good action. The main character is pretty scrappy and holds her own. It definitely doesn't shy away from some of the terrible things that happen when people are pushed to the extreme. So there is some content warnings for attempted rape and things like that. So, you know, keep that in mind. But again, this felt like young adult, and so nothing was pushed to the extreme. And so I think this book is very accessible and would definitely be a good place to start if you're trying to get a younger reader into adult fiction and maybe they're a little bit turned off or intimidated by the really chunky classics that are out there. So not my favorite, but you know what? I flew through it. It was easy to read. And again, I was in a slumpy mood, so it hit the bill at the time and, you know, fit what I was looking for. So that's it for this video. I'd love to hear down below what is a post-apocalyptic book that I should be reading, because I would love to read more of the genre. But I'll be honest, The Wolves of Winter left me a little bit disappointed and wanting more. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of thrillers, horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. You can still help me out by hitting that notification bell, giving this video a thumbs up, or sharing it around online. Otherwise, I will talk to you again soon. Thanks, Kate. Bye-bye.